Welcome to Chapter 13, Music Performance. So, I've given you a video of a young girl at the age of 14, and the news article that came out the next day was Girl at 14 conquers the Tanglewood with three violins. The beginning of the video is in a different language, but continue watching and you can see the performance. It's a older video, but as you can see, this girl who is a violin player, um, her violin breaks three times during a performance of the Bernstein's Serenade. And it's really interesting to watch because the first time her string breaks, she then grabs the first chair violinist's violin, and then that string breaks, and then she grabs another violinist, and it's really interesting to watch. But the thing to also take away from this is that her performance was still wonderful. She didn't freak out, she didn't break down, or she still continued to perform. And so it's just really interesting to watch. Now, when we're talking about music performance, we'll go from maybe the conductor's point of view and then go to the performer's side. Now, Arturo Toscanini was a amazing conductor. He actually had very poor eyesight, but however, he had incredible memory. And as you can see, that he memorized over 250 symphonic works, nearly 100 operas, and this was in addition to small music or solo literature. I've incorporated or embedded a YouTube clip that gives a video of Arturo Toscanini conducting a symphony orchestra. And as you can see, in some parts, in the whole time, but when it looks down below his eyes, you can actually see that he's not using a score. Everything is memorized, which is amazing because sometimes these symphonic works can be 45, 50 minutes long. One of the interesting quotes I found about Arturo was a bassoonist approached him with a broken key before a concert, and he replied, "That's all right. That note does not occur in tonight's concert." That is amazing to me, to know that he knew all the parts so well that he even knew that the bassoon player was not playing that note that concert, and he didn't even need the key. So, amazing, amazing human being with incredible memory. So, Jorgensen, 2004, established two-thirds of empirical research on musical practice in the last century occurred only after 1990. So only really a small amount of research has been done before 1990. Excuse me. So the chapter that you're reading this week is organized from a portion of Bloom's taxonomy of educational objectives. So coming from the cognitive side, the psychomotor side, the affective domains. Now, what I've embedded here was a link it's more of a teacher resource, but as you can see, it does go over Bloom's taxonomy, and it does go over the cognitive, psychomotor, affective domains. These objectives, talking about the cognitive, psychomotor, and affective domains, we then transition to them to motor skills, cognitive skills, and expressive skills. And that's more of talking about when we talk about research and musical performance. Now, the virtuoso performer has an amazing physical power. Virtuoso meaning the top of their game, a very famous performer. And you can listen to these YouTube clips throughout, but it's amazing to know that this one player could play over 1,200 notes in 105 seconds. That's amazing. And there is a video clip right there of it. It may not be the exact one that says 1,242 notes in 105 seconds, but it's pretty close. This is just something that's been recorded. But again, you can see how fast it is. Again, here are other things that have been composed about motor skills. A list, more of a piano composer and also a pianist himself. He requires 1,800 notes per minute, or 30 seconds, or 30 notes per second, which is amazing to me. Which, if you kind of want to do the math of Liszt's music for this piece, the Paganini Etude, there's 600 separate note motor actions per second in just fingers alone. And for this piece, it would require 3,759,600 just motor movements in total, which is just unbelievable to me. So when we talk about a music performer who has a high level of playing, they have strong memory skills, they have complex integration, and they have muscular coordination, perfectly controlled voluntary movements. Think about it when you watch a piano player, a high-level performance piano player. Just think about, watch their hands. Or if you see a trumpet player that's performing, watch their lips, watch their fingers over the valves of the trumpet, or any note, a clarinetist, and watch how the high-level performers, it's just a very kind of voluntary movements. It's very smooth, and it doesn't look hard at all. They make it look easy. So the neuromotor aspects of music making. The act of making music is so connected with physical actions that one neurologist calls musicians small muscle athletes. So really think about, what fine motor skills do musicians train? So again, you can think about the pianist. They work with their fingers. If they are a trumpet player, again, they still have finger coordinations, but they also use breathing. They also use their lips to make sounds. And again, that's with anything. Vocalists, they use their vocal cords. And again, it's not just one muscle. It's a lot of muscles going on at the same time, or training the muscles. And again, the more you train, the better you get at it. So again, here are some examples: lips, tongues, larynx, fingers, and hands. So the benefits of making music, and this goes back to the previous chapter where we talk about musicians' brains are different than non-musician brains. Music and music performance activates multiple brain regions that music can be highly coordinated. Again, think about it. You are reading the music. You are performing the music. You may be thinking about what's coming up. You may be thinking about how to interpret something. But the important part to realize from this is it helps increase the corpus callosum. Now, the corpus callosum are the fibers that connect the two lobes. The two hemispheres of the brain. Again, at the bottom it says the corpus callosum helps the two halves of the body to operate as an integrated unit. Now, me, as a left-handed person, there are a lot of things that I can do with my left hand that I struggle to do with my right. But again, thinking about it, if I started using my right hand more, I would have a stronger fiber connection between the two hemispheres. The more I do something with the right hand, the more that my brain would have those connective tissues that allow my right side of my body to do more of the things that my left side can do. Again, it takes practice. I had a doctor one time that I was talking to him about this, and he said, if you're right-handed, try eating with your left hand more, or try texting with your right hand versus your dominant hand that you usually go with, and vice versa. If you're right-handed, go with left hand. Again, this just helps with coordination. But think about, piano players. They're using both their left and right hand at the same time. They're also using their feet. Organ players, watch an organist perform. They have two hands going at one time, and they also have their feet going along the pedals at the bottom of the organ. Just fascinating to me. So each hemisphere of the brain has sensory motor areas. Again, if you're looking at the left hemisphere versus, the right hemisphere, there's just certain areas that have sensory motor areas of each hemisphere. Again, you can look through this. It's just kind of interesting to look at and kind of dissect this diagram as for what it is. So, in front of the motor cortex, in the graph or the picture that you see on the right side, if you locate where the primary motor cortex is, you'll find that, again, the premotor cortex is in front of it, and then also the supplementary motor area is in front of the motor cortex. This area of the brain, the premotor cortex, deals with preparing and planning. The supplementary motor cortex plays the role in coordination of the two hands, also sequencing complex movements and executing sequential motor movements that depend on internal cues. Example, memorized music performance. Now again, think about if something happened to that part of the brain. If it was damaged for some odd reason, you will most likely have some type of hindrance, some type of coordination problem if that part of the brain is affected. The basal ganglia, as you can see, it's kind of in the middle, kind of around where the thalamus, the sensory gateway is. It's behind, it's in front of the hippocampus. And it's basically a large cluster of cells, and it's involved in the coordinating of muscle actions. So again, the basal ganglia is involved in coordinating muscle actions. The acquisition of motor skills. Motor learning involves changes in behavior that result from physical changes in the brain. And I think right there that speaks for itself. Motor learning involves changes in behavior that result from physical changes in the brain. Again, I think it is worth repeating. This gives rise to the notion of plasticity in the brain. When we went back and talked about music in the brain, we talked about plasticity and the brain's ability to change itself. Now, playing or singing requires motor control on timing. We talk about rhythm, sequencing, and spatial organization of movement. So we can talk about pitch. They're able to do all these different things. And it's important, when we start developing the understanding of the acquisition of motor skills. So the question is, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Now, if any of you ever visited Carnegie Hall or taking a tour of New York, I think the New York tour buses do this, but they always ask you, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? And the answer is practice, practice, practice. And again, that's true. Anytime that you see someone who is good at what they do. Whether they are a sports athlete, whether they are a musician, whether they are a top scholar in their field, what they've done is they've practiced. Now again, this is different from maybe a prodigy, or a musical savant, if you want to call that. That's totally different than, I guess if you want to say, the normal person that you might see performing at Carnegie Hall. The way they got there was to practice a lot. So as you can see, the tennis player Pete Sampras, this tennis players holder of 14 Grand Slam singles titles in tennis, describing that in order for him to do this, he hit 1 million balls to burn in the muscle memory so that he could hit his shots automatically. Think about that, hitting 1 million tennis balls in order to have that muscle memory in order so he could make his shots automatically. So Ericsson, Kramp, and Tess Romer, they said that it takes approximately 10,000 hours of deliberate practice, which kind of goes over a full decade. So to think about it, you can say that for someone to be a great musician or a great sports player, it takes about 10 years to become great at it. Again, they said takes approximately 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. Now, deliberate practice here means meaningful practice. You're not just going into the practice room, or you're not just going out to the softball field and just throwing balls and not really caring where they go or end up, or if you're in the practice room, you're just running through something and you're not really thinking about it. No, it's something that you have to have deliberate practice techniques, something that you are cognitively always thinking about. So their study concluded that the best violinist had accumulated 10,000 hours of practice. The good violinist had only practiced about 7,500 hours. And then the least accomplished, a little over 4,000 hours of practice. Again, I think if you ever see the top players of maybe a symphony orchestra, you would find that those people probably practiced a lot in order to get to where they are. Focal dystonia. This is a very horrible disorder, and I hope it never happens to any of my musician friends or to anyone, period. But the focal dystonia is a task-specific movement disorder. It's described as a painless loss of muscular control of complex, overlearned movements. A lot of times it affects the hands. Maybe there's a piano player and they have practiced so much that they actually end up losing muscular control. And basically it's overlearned movements. It can be from practicing too much. Again, if you look at brass players, this is something that I know a couple of people that have focal dystonia, where they're not able to control their lips to vibrate. And basically, they can't play much anymore. And they're not able to keep a good, solid sound. And I've just put a YouTube clip of an example of focal dystonia. Again, it can be due to over-practicing. And basically, but think about it. If you are diagnosed as focal dystonia, but yet you were a musician and that was your only source of income, that's your life. So again, hopefully as we progress through decades, that research and medical procedures will understand this better. And there's numerous research out there already. So, quality of practice. Again, we're going back to the 10,000 hours of a deliberate practice and defining what that is. So, given a task within a well-defined goal. So, in a practice room, or if you're outside hitting tennis balls, or any type of, you're getting better at throwing the football, or any type of thing that requires muscle memory, you have a given task with a well-defined goal. You know what your end product is. You're motivated to improve. You don't just settle for average. You're provided with feedback. Now, this can be personal, or this can be from someone else. Again, a lot of times, no matter what, we've all started with maybe a tutor or a private instructor. And this happens all the time. No one just starts playing an instrument or starts playing tennis or baseball without having someone at least say something to them eventually. Now, it's provided also, when we're talking about deliberate practice, provided with ample opportunities for repetition and gradual refinement of their performance. One thing I did as a private instructor for French horn is I made my students, I had 5 pieces of candy on the stand. And maybe they were having a problem with a line out of the book. And so I kind of did a little bit of behavioral reinforcement of practicing. But what I told them to do is, during a practice session, play through the line. Every time that you get it perfect, you get that candy bar or that whatever the reward is. However, if you mess up, you have to restart over again. Again, this is allowing for the opportunity for repetition and to gradually get better on their performance. Now, whether to say that was not good for all students, and I didn't do it for all my students, but I did do for the students who they liked a physical reward in their hands. Again, these are for young students, and not college students. Although I'm sure some college students wouldn't mind getting candy for practicing. All right, now mental rehearsal studies. This is actually really interesting for musicians. One study divided subjects who had neither played the piano before into 3 groups. The first group learned and practiced a specific 5-note pattern on the piano. Another group played random finger patterns on the piano. And the third group just mentally rehearsed the same 5-finger patterns as the first group. So the same specific 5-finger pattern, but only mentally. The group that practiced the specific 5-fingered pattern and mentally rehearsed was the better one. Of course, the ones that did random did not do well at all. The area, so when we're looking at these 2 groups, the area of the motor cortex controlling fingers tripled in size for the ones that did mental rehearsal and did the specific 5-finger pattern. The group that randomly played had no change in the motor cortex area. Again, that goes back to the mental rehearsal studies, the deliberate practice, that it has to have some meaning in order for it to have some change on the brain. Now, this is really interesting when we start talking about musical expression. Click on this. Now, again, it's a very long opera, but start at 122, about 2 hours in. And this is from Strauss's Salome. Now, again, Salome was from the Bible, and she was known to have ordered for John the Baptist's head to be cut off and served on a platter. Now, what's really, again, you can maybe think she's not stable at this point in her life, but as she's looking at the head on the platter, she kisses the face of John the Baptist. Now, again, you can watch it or not, but this is an actually live performed opera. Very, very dramatic. But when we talk about musical expression, this Salome, this performer, gives a fantastic example of over exaggeration, but done very well. So again, I know that we don't have group discussions, but think about these questions as you move forward. Why are musicians called small muscle athletes? What does it imply? Again, going back to kind of the beginning of the presentation or the PowerPoint, we discussed that. To what extent were your parents, guardians involved in your early musical studies? Even if you didn't have, maybe you didn't grow up taking music lessons. Maybe you did athletic sports. So what type of extent were your parents or guardians involved in that? Were they very supportive? Did they say you had to do it? Did they provide support? Did they drive you there? Did they purchase things for you? It doesn't necessarily have to be just about music. And then my last question is for my music majors to think about is what suggestions have your teachers given you to improve musical expressiveness? Have they modeled expressiveness to you? Now, again, coming from a non-musician point of view, has your private instructors, did they ever model like good technique to you on how to properly hold the bat? Or did they just tell you what to do? Was it something that they visually showed you, or was it something just verbally said? These are things just to think about as you read through the chapter and reflect. All right, that is the end of Chapter 13. Now, I will post a different article. It's not required to read, but I hope that you might read through it because it talks about the role of deliberate practice in the acquisition, the gaining of expert performance. So it's a great article by Erickson. We did talk about them earlier in the chapter. We did talk about their study. And you can also read Jorgensen. He's kind of one of the first people talking about how the brain changes with musical performance. All right, I will upload this to Blackboard, and you're able to read it if you have the time.